turn to Luke chapter 18. Luke chapter 18. Read the first 8 verses. And he spake a parable unto them to this end, that men ought always to pray, and not to faint, saying, there was in a city a judge which feared not God, neither regarded man. And there was a widow in that city, and she came unto him, that is the judge, saying, avenge me of mine adversary. And he would not for a while. But afterward he said within himself, though I fear not God, nor regard man, yet because this widow troubleth me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. And the Lord said, hear what the unjust judge saith. And shall not God avenge his own elect, which cry day and night unto him, though he bear along with them? I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith on the earth? Notice that this chapter begins with and, indicating a continuation of what has gone before. And it is, and he, Jesus, spake a parable unto them. The them are the disciples, back in chapter 17, verse 22. So this parable is a part of what we just read in chapter 17, verses 22 through verse 37, where Christ speaks upon the days leading to the physical setting up of the kingdom. And in so doing, he speaks of his second coming in both of its stages, the rapture and the revelation aspects of his return. So the parable is a part of his teaching concerning the days leading to his return, which are the days in which we live. So it's to be viewed in that light, this parable. In Christ's teaching, verse 22 through 37 of chapter 17, he gave some warnings against getting caught up in the world's way of life, getting caught up with just life itself, being distracted from the Lord and the matters of the Lord. Now the actual parable is recorded in verses 2 through 5. That's the actual parable. The intent, the purpose, the design, the point of the parable. Verse 1 is introduced by the words, to this end. He spake a parable unto them to this end, for this objective. And then that is followed by the stated purpose, that men ought always to pray and not to faint. So that's the object of the parable. That's the point of the parable. Continual and persevering prayer. Again, in the light of, in the context of, the days preceding his return. Now, in the parable, there are two main characters. You have a judge who is the antithesis of God. You have a widow. She represents God's people. And in addition to those two, there is an adversary who would typify Satan and opposition. Following the parable, verse 6, Jesus issues a call to seriously consider and to be encouraged from the practical instruction of the parable. Hear what the unjust judge saith. Verse 7, he draws a conclusion from the judge as the antithesis of the Lord. Shall not God avenge his own elect which cry day and night unto him, though he bear long with them? And then in verse 8, he affirms the conclusion. I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. And then he makes application by asking a question. Nevertheless, that is, God will avenge his elect. He will. But nevertheless, when the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith on the earth? That question is for the purpose of application. Notice that in this application portion, there are several truths that are stated. Well, three. Three absolute truths stated. The Lord has a people. The Lord has a people. They're referred to as his own elect. Secondly, the Lord will avenge. He will vindicate. He will liberate his people. I tell you that he will avenge them. That is, his own elect, speedily. And thirdly, the Lord Jesus Christ shall return when the Son of Man cometh. When the Son of Man cometh. Now, no doubt these truths are stated as incentive, stated as encouragement to do what the parable teaches. What does the parable teach? That men ought always to pray and not to faint. But again, as part of the application, there's this question asked. Shall he find faith when he returns? Shall he find faith on the earth? Now, it's not our purpose to preach upon this parable. We've done that several times. But I want to take the main thought of the message from this question. Shall he find faith on the earth? And our subject is the faith needed in distracting times. What we see in the parable are some marked characteristics that ought to mark every child of God. Again, the purpose, the objective of the parable is that men ought always to pray and not to faint. That states what ought to be a characteristic of God's people in the context of the days in which we live. There is a positive. Men ought. Men ought. The word ought is a word of obligation. It is a word of duty. But is it not also a word of advisability? You ought to do such and such. You're advising. So it's a word of advisability. It's also a word of opportunity. He ought to take this opportunity. So, men ought always, that is, unceasingly, perpetually, has a way of obligation and duty, has a way of advice, has an opportunity. Men ought always to pray. New Testament teaches that. It's Ephesians 6:18. Praying always in all prayer and supplication in the Spirit. It is Colossians 4 verse 2. Continue in prayer. It is 1 Thessalonians 5:17. Pray without ceasing. To pray always means several things. It means that we can pray everywhere. Paul addressed such. 1 Timothy 2 verse 8, I will that men pray everywhere. To pray always means that we can pray about everything. Philippians 4 verse 6, be careful for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, make your requests made known unto God. No matter what, no matter where, we are never to abandon prayer. So what is prayer? What is prayer? Well, if you take the teaching of prayer in the Bible, you could come up with a biblical definition of prayer. And I believe a biblical definition of prayer would be a sincere, sensible, affectionate pouring out of the heart or soul unto God through Christ, by the strength and by the assistance of the Holy Spirit. For such things as God has promised, for such things that are according to His Word, and must be done so in submission by faith to the will of God. That would be a biblical definition of prayer. Prayer is a drawing near unto God. We have not prayed if we do not draw near to God. It is a coming unto the throne of grace. Prayer is an expression of a longing for God. It is also an expression of need. And it's described in Psalm 116 verse 4 as a calling upon the name of the Lord. And in Psalm 27 verse 7, it is a crying unto God. In Exodus 32 verse 11, it is a beseeching of the Lord. In Job 8 verse 5, it is a seeking of God. In Psalm 27 verse 8, it is a seeking the face of the Lord. So prayer is a fervent expression of a longing. And it is an element of worship. In prayer we worship. In worship we pray. It is the divinely ordained means of communion with God. That men ought always to pray. Then there is a negative stated, and not to faint. In the context, that's in the context of praying always. Praying always and not fainting. Praying always and not becoming unenthusiastic and half-hearted. It is never give up praying and faint not. Persevere in prayer. The words "and not to faint" reveal that prayer is to be passionate. Prayer is to be intense. Again, all of this is in the context of the days in which we live. People ought not be praying less. They ought to be praying more. And praying ought to be more passionate and more intense. You see, in the Old Testament, People prayed and fasted. In the New Testament, they prayed and fasted. Today, we have prayer breakfast. Big difference. Big difference. The words, "and not to faint," reveal that prayer involves commitment. Prayer involves dedication. These words, "not to faint," also reveal that prayer is a labor. It's a work. It takes effort. It takes spiritual stamina to truly pray. Paul said of Epaphras in Colossians 4 verse 12, "always laboring fervently for you in prayers." He labored fervently in prayers. Because when you truly pray, Satan's forces are going to show up. And you're going to have to labor. You're going to have to labor. Labor fervently. To not faint means that true praying requires strength. It requires divine enablement. Again, men ought always to pray and not to faint. That states the importance of praying. That states the importance of continuing to pray. In order to do this, one cannot lose sight of God. You cannot become oblivious of God. Again, the context, by becoming so occupied, so consumed, so entangled, so mired in and governed by the times or by the ordinary activities of life that you don't have time to pray. And that you don't even think to pray. That's what we have to be aware of. That's the danger. As the children of God, we must not lose heart. Why? And we ought to realize it more and more as we get deeper into the last days. There's too much at stake. There's too much at stake. There's too much at stake to watch the news rather than pray. Some catastrophe happens. And all of God's people, with the world, turns on the news and sit glued for hours. God's people, when those things happen, ought to go to their prayer closet and pray, but they don't think about it. That's shameful. But that's where we are today. That's where we are. That's what life does. That's the danger that we live in. So we cannot lose sight of God. Again, Psalm 46 verse 10, "Be still and know that I am God." Know that I am God. We cannot lose heart. There's too much at stake. We cannot lose heart. The cause is too great. We're to be a people of prayer. A people of perseverance. And this is illustrated in the widow of the parable. She rose above disappointment. She rose above frustration. She rose above discouragement. And she continually went to the judge, or she continually prayed. She was insistent. She was determined. She was relentless. In spite of all the obstacles, she remained constant. She remained persistent. Her life was marked by perseverance. Her life was marked by steadfastness and conviction and courage. And what enabled her to do these things is found in the question, "When the Son of Man cometh, shall He find faith on the earth?" Well, what does He mean by faith? The faith of this widow. shall he find that kind of faith when he comes? Many take the question to mean there'll be few that are saved when he comes. I believe that's so, but I don't believe that's what he's talking about here. Many believe it's that there won't be many standing for the truth. I believe that's also so, but I don't believe that's what he's talking about here. In the context, he's talking about this kind of faith. The faith that this widow possessed. So let's look at the question. The question has several implications. The question implies that this faith is rare. This kind of faith that he's talking about is rare. Shall he find? There's also the implication that this faith is something that the Lord has high regard for. It's something that's very pleasing to him. I believe the question also implies the importance of this kind of faith. He's speaking of something very significant. He's speaking of something that has great consequence. The question implies, again, that when Christ returns, this particular kind of faith will be quite scarce. It'll be quite scarce. The implications of the question serve as a warning. And it should become very concerning to us. And it should be a very searching question. When the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith on the earth? Will he find hearts fixed upon the Lord? Or will he find hearts wedded to the world? What does faith do? Faith tells us that there's more to life than life. Faith tells us that. Faith also links us to God. Now in the parable, this widow, consider her faith. She had a faith that caused her to know, caused her to recognize, caused her to acknowledge that this judge held a position and had the authority and had the power and had the ability to help and deliver her. She believed that. And this gripped her heart. She believed it so strongly that no matter what else happened, nothing changed her belief that this judge had the authority and the power and the ability to help her. She had a faith that did not need confirmation and validation from the world. True faith does not need confirmation. I'm not against visiting Noah's Ark or any of those type of things. But I don't need that to confirm what I know by faith. Well, now I really believe. Faith does not need that kind of confirmation. Does not need that validation. Again, when the Son of Man cometh, shall he find this kind of faith on the earth? A faith that knows, A faith that is absolutely persuaded that no matter what the situation, no matter what the circumstance, no matter the magnitude of the problem or the trial or the difficulty or the need or the infirmity, and no matter how big the giant, and no matter how massive the obstacle, and no matter how numerous and mighty the enemy, and no matter how wide the river, or how long the road, or how steep the mountain, or how deep the pit, a faith that knows there is a God in heaven, and I can go to Him. Will He find that kind of faith? A faith that goes to God first, not after you've run out of all other options. A faith that believes that He reigns supreme, that He excels all, that He is absolute, that He is sovereign, He is almighty, He is eternal, immortal, immutable, infinite, omniscient, all-sufficient, faithful, merciful, gracious, living, conquering, and triumphant. The question is, will the Lord find this kind of faith when He returns? Will He find faith-driven lives? What drove this woman? What drove this widow? Her faith. Will the Lord find faith-driven lives? I believe it'll be scarce. That's why the question is asked. In the parable, the widow had a faith that had a life-altering impact. It caused her to unashamedly seek the judge, come before him. This was her impulse. Her heart was drawn to that judge, who is again the antithesis of God. So how much more our hearts? This judge was not an afterthought to her, but day and night she was steadfastly minded. I've got to get to that judge. And we ought to be steadfastly minded every single day, every single night. I've got to talk to God. I've got to go before God. Will He find that kind of faith? She had a faith that moved her in the direction of God. True faith always moves in the direction of God. A faith that caused her to pursue the judge. The question is, when the Son of Man cometh, shall He find this kind of faith on the earth? A faith that continually drives one in the direction of God. We know that the current of the world is away from God. And that current is getting stronger all the time. But there is such a thing as a faith that goes against the current, drawing us continually to God. Will the Lord find this kind of faith when He returns? Will He find faith-driven lives? They'll be scarce. In the parable, the widow had a faith that caused her to plead with the judge. She had a faith that placed all. She placed her life in the hand of this judge. And we read, he would not. He would not. But guess what? She didn't have an alternative plan. She didn't have plan B. She had plan, what we need is just plan God. I've got to tell God. But what if He doesn't answer? That's all I got. That's all I got. What if He doesn't answer in 3 or 4 days? That's all you've got. There is no alternative plan. It's God. That's the kind of faith we need. Will He find that kind of faith? She was so convinced, so persuaded, so confident in her belief concerning the judge that she saw no other option. No other option. It's a big problem today. God's people leave themselves a lot of options, and usually God's at the bottom of the list. There's no other option. It's God. No other alternative course. No other alternative action other than Him. That's the kind of faith she had. Will the Lord find such a faith amongst us? A faith that makes us a constantly praying people. A faith that puts us on our knees before God. A lot of things happening in the world, all around us. Somebody needs to pray. Somebody needs to go and talk to God. And that ought to be us. That ought to be us. The news media, our thoughts and prayers are with such and such. That doesn't mean a thing. What do they even mean by that? Somebody needs to pray. And that ought to be us. Again, it gets back to if my people, oh, we need this faith. In the parable, the widow had a faith that caused her to know that nothing was more important than what the judge could give her. She knew that. She had a faith that shaped her life, that controlled and dominated her life. Her thought process is, I've got to get to the judge. She bugged him so much that he just gave her what she wanted. The lesson of the parable is not to bug God. The lesson of the parable is keep praying. Keep praying. This was her priority. I've got to get to the judge. Did she have other things to do day and night? Certainly she did. But her priority was, I've got to get to the judge. And oh, that it would be that we would have such a faith that it would be our priority day and night. I've got to talk to God. I've got to talk to God. She had a faith that would not permit life to get in the way of her getting to the judge. That's the whole warning that we mentioned this morning. Life gets in the way. That's a great danger. Life, not necessarily sinful life, just life gets in the way. Gets in the way of praying. Gets in the way of thinking. It gets in the way of spiritual matters. Her attitude was, I've got to get to the judge. He's the only one who can help me. He's the only one. And I'm not going to allow people or circumstances to keep me from Him. I've got to get to Him. She had a faith that did not allow her to become entangled with the affairs of life. Day and night. Day and night. The question is, will the Lord find such faith amongst us? A faith that makes God and the matters of God the emphasis and the object in the center. Life is not the emphasis. Life is not the center. God is. A faith that causes us to have more attentiveness to God than the things of the world. More fascination for the things of God than the things of the world. More concern for the things of God than the things of the world. More involvement in the spiritual than the temporal. Faith. Will he find that kind of faith? I'm talking about a faith that causes you to think right and make right choices. It's a faith that is able to say no. No to the aspirations, to the pursuits, to the idols of our times. A faith that gives God's people to just say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going along with that. No. No. It's a faith that will keep us from being pulled in and from being depleted and drained and stuck and defined and controlled by circumstances. A lot of God's people stuck. They need faith. Faith. In the parable, the widow had a faith that was unstoppable. Nobody could stop her from getting to the judge. And so it must be with us. What does it take to stop us? Not much for most. What does it take? She had a faith that enabled her to endure. We're told all the time, and I think it's so, but people can't endure much anymore. They don't have what it takes. But I'm not concerning myself with that. I'm concerning myself with the ability to endure for spiritual matters. We have to endure trials and hardships. That takes faith. That takes faith. She had a faith that caused her to be unwavering. Unwavering. She had a faith that gave her spiritual stamina. Spiritual fortitude. Spiritual resolve. Faith. Will the Lord find that kind of faith? It'll be rare. It is rare. It is scarce. She had a faith that just didn't allow her to become discouraged. She had a faith that would not allow her to be disheartened. In spite of everything seemingly against her, she had this faith. A faith that would not allow her to sink in despondency. She went to the judge time and time again, and he said, no. No, don't bother me. But she had a faith that would not allow her to sink in despondency. Today you go to God, you ask God for something, you ask God to do something. He doesn't do it in 5 minutes and people sink in despondency. Well, I'm going to try plan B. Well, plan B is not going to work. Neither is plan C or D or E. It's not going to work. God's it. In spite of all the obstacles, she had a faith that never stopped believing. He can avenge me. In spite of all the hostility, in spite of criticism, she had a faith that would not allow her to become half-hearted. That's where we are. That's the days of Noah and Lot, half-heartedness in spiritual matters. And as Brother Matsuda mentioned Wednesday night, we think God should be happy with that. If God's people really believe that, just give God the leftovers. He'll be happy with it. As Malachi said, give that to your governor and see how far it gets you. She remained constant. She remained persistent. She continued on. She pressed forward. She had an adversary, but she persevered. She had cares. She had burdens. She had problems. She had sorrows. She had heartaches. She had disappointments. But she had a faith that drove her to God. She had a faith-driven life. Will he find that kind of faith when he returns? She had a faith that continued to believe in spite of appearance that the judge could deliver her from her tormentor. A faith that caused her to just keep depending on him. Keep relying upon him. When he said no, she just kept on depending upon him. A faith that kept her coming to the Lord. Will he find that kind of faith? A faith that caused her to pour out her soul day and night unto him. Again, the question is, will the Lord find such faith amongst us? A faith that presses through the most fierce winds. A faith that moves us beyond the fortifications and the threats of the enemy. A faith that causes us to press on in spite of appearances. If my people. The question is, will the Lord find this kind of faith when he returns? Will he find faith-driven lives? What is it that drives our life? What is it? What drives our lives? Again, faith attaches the individual to the Lord. The danger in Luke 17 is being attached to life. Being so attached to life that we become oblivious to the Lord. Faith attaches us to the Lord. We need this faith. And we need to ask ourselves, where are we attached? Where are we attached? Again, all of this is in the context of the Lord's return. Do we really want the Lord to come? Do we really? Or are we too attached to this world? Not necessarily the sinful, because that's immediately where people's minds go. Just attached to life. Just so attached to life that we can't let go. So attached to the ordinary, common activities of life that we can't let go for God. That's where we are today. We need faith. We need faith. Oh, may we be a people with the faith of this widow. When the Lord returns, will he find you and I faith-driven lives, attached and linked to him, to this life in this world? Will he find faith? I consider that a very solemn question. It is a question about our faith, intended to evoke great thought. It's not a question just intended for a yes or no answer. It's a question intended to evoke thought. Not just yes or no, but a question intended to evoke concern, to evoke personal examination. Will he find that faith in me, in you? Oh, how we need this faith. Again, it's no wonder that the apostles prayed, Lord, increase our faith. You can't live the spiritual life without it. Can't be done. Lord, increase our faith. And I've heard people say, I've heard preachers preach from the pulpit, don't pray that prayer, you're asking for trouble. How shameful. How shameful to tell someone not to pray for more faith, because it might cause a hardship on you. What are they emphasizing? The importance of you. That's the whole problem. And as soon as someone makes a statement like that, they've identified themselves as part of the problem. Increase our faith. Increase our faith. Whatever it takes. We must see faith so important that we just want it to increase. We want it to grow. God help us. Brother Dave, if you come and lead us in verse